I picked up my wine glass. Then I stopped. Something was wrong. I didn't know what. Not yet. But my hand knew before my brain did. It hovered there, an inch above the glass, and something deep inside me said, don't. 68 years old. 40 years building a company from nothing. You don't survive that long in business without learning to trust that feeling. The one that shows up before the facts do. I looked across the table at my daughter. Emily. She was smiling. Too wide. Her eyes were on my glass, not on my face. And her husband, Ryan, was talking. Fast. Too fast. Something about a golf trip. Something about his father's old boat. Words that meant nothing, except they were working very hard to keep my attention away from that glass. I want you to understand something before I go further. This was supposed to be the best night of my life. 3 days earlier, I sold my biotechnology company for $60 million. 40 years of my life. Sleepless nights. Failed trials. Mortgaged houses. All of it, finally, worth something the world could see. And for the first time in 5 years, my daughter had called me. Not texted. Called. Dad, she'd said, I want to celebrate with you. I cried when I hung up the phone. A grown man, sitting alone in his kitchen, crying because his daughter finally wanted to see him. So I booked the private room at the restaurant. The good wine. I even bought a new suit. I was so happy to see her walk in that night. I didn't notice what I should have noticed. I didn't notice that Ryan chose my seat for me. I didn't notice that the waiter, a young man named Evan, kept glancing at our table like he was watching for something. I didn't notice, until it was almost too late, that my daughter's hand had drifted toward my wine glass while Ryan leaned in close and said, Peter, you have to hear this story. That's when I felt it. That cold, quiet warning. I looked down at my glass. There was nothing to see. No color change. No smell. Just wine, dark red, catching the candlelight. But I have built and lost and rebuilt an empire. I have sat across from men who smiled while they lied to my face. Men who shook my hand while planning to ruin me. I know what a performance looks like. And that night, my own daughter was performing for me. I didn't say anything. I smiled back. I laughed at Ryan's story about the boat. I let them believe I noticed nothing. But under the table, my hand was already moving. Slowly, carefully, I turned my glass, just slightly, toward Emily's side of the table. And I waited. A few minutes later, our young waiter came back to refill the water. As he leaned across the table, he did something strange. He looked directly at me, just for a second, long enough for me to see something in his eyes. He set the water down, and as he did, his sleeve brushed my arm. I felt something. Paper. A small folded note, pressed into my palm so quickly I almost missed it. I closed my fingers around it and said nothing. Ryan didn't notice. Emily didn't notice. I excused myself to the restroom a few minutes later. Alone, behind a locked door, I opened the note with shaking hands. Don't drink the wine. Please. I stood there for a long moment, staring at those 6 words. My chest felt tight. My mind raced through 100 questions at once. Who was this boy? How did he know? And most of all, why would my own daughter want to hurt me? I splashed water on my face. I looked at the man in the mirror. 68 years old. Rich beyond anything I ever imagined. And in that moment, more afraid than I had been in 40 years of business. But something else rose up in me too. Something colder. Sharper. I had spent my whole life reading people before they could hurt me. I wasn't going to stop now. Not with my own daughter. I walked back to that table with a smile on my face. And a plan already forming in my mind. Because in less than 10 minutes, someone at that table was going to drink from the wrong glass. And it wasn't going to be me. My name is Peter Shaw, and before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand who I was before that night, because none of this makes sense unless you know where I started. I grew up in a small house with a leaking roof and a father who worked himself into an early grave at a factory that never once said thank you. I promised myself I would never live like that. At 22, with almost nothing in my bank account, I started a small biotechnology lab in a rented garage with 2 other scientists who believed in the same crazy dream I did. We failed more times than I can count. There were years when I couldn't pay myself a salary, years when I sold my car just to make payroll for my employees, years when my wife, Margaret, would quietly move money between accounts so the bank wouldn't notice we were nearly broke. She believed in me even when I stopped believing in myself. And I think that's the only reason the company survived those early years at all. Emily was born during the hardest stretch of it all, in a small apartment above a hardware store. And I remember holding her for the first time and promising her, silently, that she would never know the kind of poverty I grew up with. I kept that promise. Maybe I kept it too well. As the company grew, so did the distance between us. I told myself I was building something for her future, but the truth is I missed her school plays. I missed her birthdays. I missed the small, ordinary moments that actually make a father and daughter close. I was in a lab in another city when she took her first steps. I was in a boardroom negotiating a contract when she graduated high school. Margaret used to tell me, gently, that success without your family beside you isn't really success at all. But I didn't listen. Not really. Not until it was too late to change anything. Margaret passed away when Emily was 24. And something broke between Emily and me after that. I think she blamed me, quietly, for all those missed years, for choosing the company over her mother's final months, and maybe she was right to blame me. We spoke less and less after the funeral. Holidays became phone calls. Phone calls became text messages. Text messages became silence that stretched for months at a time. I told myself she was busy building her own life with Ryan, that this was simply what happens between parents and grown children. But somewhere underneath that excuse, I knew the truth. I had spent so many years building an empire that I forgot to build a relationship with the one person who mattered more than any of it. So when Emily called me 3 days after I sold the company, when I heard her voice say, "Dad, I want to celebrate with you," something inside my chest that had been closed for 5 years cracked open all at once. I told myself this was my second chance. I told myself maybe selling the company wasn't just about the money. Maybe it was the universe giving me one more opportunity to become the father I should have been all along. I spent those 3 days like a young man preparing for his first date. I researched her favorite restaurant. I remembered, from some old conversation years ago, that she loved a certain kind of red wine, and I made sure the restaurant had it ready. I even practiced what I would say to her, standing alone in my bathroom mirror like a fool, rehearsing an apology for all the years I wasn't there. I wanted to tell her that the $60 million meant nothing to me if it couldn't buy back the time we lost. I wanted to tell her that I was proud of the woman she'd become, even though I barely knew that woman anymore. I wanted, more than anything, to hear her call me Dad the way she used to when she was small, back when I was still her hero and not just a distant man who sent birthday cards with money folded inside instead of showing up in person. Ryan, her husband, I had only met a handful of times. He seemed charming enough at first glance, the kind of man who shakes your hand firmly and laughs at your jokes a little too loudly, but there was always something behind his eyes that I couldn't quite name. Margaret used to say you can tell everything about a man by watching how he treats people who can't do anything for him. And looking back now, I remember how Ryan barely looked at the waitstaff whenever we went out, how he snapped his fingers once at a young server who brought the wrong drink. I noticed it then. I chose to ignore it. That's the thing about wanting so badly to believe your family loves you. You start ignoring the small warnings your instincts hand you, one after another, until the warnings pile up so high you can't see past them anymore. So that night, walking into that restaurant, I wasn't thinking about warnings. I was thinking about second chances. I was thinking about the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. The same little girl who was now sitting across from me as a grown woman with secrets I couldn't yet imagine. I had built an empire strong enough to survive 40 years of failures and setbacks, strong enough to make me one of the wealthiest men in my industry, but nothing in that empire had prepared me for what my own daughter was capable of. I walked into that dinner believing I was finally getting my family back. I had no idea I was walking into the most dangerous night of my life, and that the people I trusted most in this world were about to teach me a lesson I would never forget. Back at the table, I sat down across from my daughter and forced my face into the same warm smile I had worn all night. But inside my mind was working faster than it had in years, running through every version of business strategy one had ever learned, because right now, this wasn't a family dinner anymore. This was a negotiation, and I was the only one at the table who knew it. Ryan kept talking, telling some long story about a business deal he was proud of, and I nodded along. But I watched his hands the whole time, the way they moved a little too much, the way his eyes kept flicking toward Emily every few seconds like he was checking to make sure she was following some plan they had rehearsed. Emily barely touched her food. She kept glancing at my wine glass, then quickly looking away when she caught me noticing, and each time she did it, that cold feeling in my chest grew a little colder. I thought about the note in my pocket, 6 words folded into a small square of paper, and I thought about the young waiter who risked his job, maybe even his safety, to hand it to me. I needed to know more before I made my next move, so I did something I hadn't done in years. I lied to my own daughter's face without blinking. I told them I was feeling a bit dizzy, that the excitement of the last few days had finally caught up to me, and I asked if I could step outside for some fresh air before dessert. Ryan offered to come with me, a little too quickly, but I waved him off and told him to keep Emily company. Outside, standing under the restaurant's awning, I saw Evan, the young waiter, taking a smoke break near the side entrance. I walked over to him slowly, casually, like I was simply getting some air, and when I got close enough, I asked him quietly what he had seen. His hands were shaking as he spoke. He told me he'd been clearing a table near ours earlier that evening when he overheard Ryan on a phone call in the hallway near the restrooms. Ryan had been talking to someone, his voice low but sharp, saying words that made Evan stop in his tracks. Evan told me Ryan had said something about a doctor, someone named Reed, and something about paperwork being ready for tomorrow morning. Evan told me Ryan had said the word guardianship. My stomach turned to ice. I asked him if he was certain about that word, and he nodded, his face pale under the streetlight. Then he told me the part that changed everything. He said that later, while bringing water to our table, he'd seen Emily's hand moving near my wine glass, and he'd seen something small and white disappear from her palm into the liquid. He said he almost said something right there at the table, but he was terrified of losing his job, terrified of getting involved in something so far above him. So instead, he found a way to slip me that note when no one was watching. I thanked him, my voice barely steady, and I asked him to please, for his own safety, act as if nothing happened for the rest of the night. He nodded, still shaking, and disappeared back inside through the side door. I stood there alone in the cold night air, my mind racing through everything I had just learned. Guardianship. That word kept echoing in my head. This wasn't about money in the way I had first assumed. This wasn't some simple scheme to drain a bank account or steal a few $1 million while I wasn't looking. Guardianship meant something far worse. It meant they wanted the courts to declare me incapable of managing my own life. It meant they wanted a judge to look at me, a 68-year-old man who had just sold a company for $60 million, and decide that I could no longer be trusted to run my own affairs. And if that happened, everything I built, everything I sacrificed my marriage and my relationship with my daughter to create, all of it would fall into the hands of the 2 people sitting at that table pretending to celebrate with me. I understood now why the substance in my wine mattered so much. It wasn't there to kill me. It was there to make me look confused, disoriented, unstable, the exact kind of behavior a lawyer could use in court to convince a judge that Peter Shaw was no longer fit to control his own fortune. My own daughter was trying to make the world believe her father had lost his mind, and she was willing to poison me at a celebration dinner to do it. I stood outside that restaurant for a long moment, feeling something inside me shift permanently. The grief I had felt for our broken relationship over the last 5 years began to harden into something else entirely. Not hatred, not yet. Something closer to clarity. Whatever love Emily might have once had for me, whatever bond one thought we still shared, had been buried under greed so deep that she was willing to destroy my mind, or at least make the world believe she had, just to get her hands on my money. I took a deep breath, straightened my jacket, and walked back inside with a calm smile on my face, because now I understood exactly what I was dealing with, and I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I wasn't going to confront them at that table. I wasn't going to make a scene. I was going to do something far more dangerous to people like Ryan and Emily. I was going to let them think their plan was working, right up until the moment it fell apart in their own hands. Section 4. Escalation Phase. I walked back into that private dining room with my heart pounding harder than it had in years, but my face showed nothing except the tired, happy smile of a father enjoying a celebration with his daughter, and I sat back down across from Emily and Ryan as if nothing in the world had changed, even though everything had changed in the last 10 minutes outside that restaurant. Ryan asked if I was feeling better, and I told him yes. Just needed some air, too much excitement for 1 week, I suppose. And he laughed that same loud laugh he always used when he wanted to seem relaxed, though now I could hear something forced underneath it, something I had never noticed before because I had never been listening for it. My wine glass sat exactly where I had left it, still turned slightly toward Emily's side of the table, and I watched carefully as the conversation continued, waiting to see what they would do next now that their window of opportunity was slipping away with every passing minute. Ryan leaned forward and suggested a toast, raising his own glass high, saying something about new beginnings and family and the incredible legacy I had built, and as he spoke, I noticed his eyes drift toward my glass one more time, checking, waiting, hoping I would finally lift it to my lips. I raised my glass along with everyone else, and for a moment I let it hover near my mouth, watching Emily's face carefully, watching the way her shoulders tensed, the way she leaned forward just slightly, waiting for the moment I would drink. Instead, I set my glass back down and said I wanted to make my own toast first, something meaningful, something from the heart, and I began speaking slowly about the years of struggle before the company succeeded, about the sacrifices Margaret and I made, about how proud I was that Emily had grown into such a strong, capable woman. And as I spoke, I watched real discomfort creep across her face, because somewhere underneath whatever plans she and Ryan had built, there was still a small part of her that couldn't quite look me in the eye while I spoke about loving her. When I finally finished my toast, I lifted my glass again, and this time, in one smooth motion that took less than a second, I switched it with Emily's glass sitting beside mine. The movement hidden perfectly behind the act of leaning in for a family toast, arms crossing naturally the way people do when clinking glasses together across a table. Neither of them noticed. Why would they? A father and daughter leaning toward each other for a toast is the most natural thing in the world, and nobody watches for a switch that fast unless they already suspect it's coming. We all drank. I watched Emily's glass touch her lips, watched her swallow, watched Ryan smile with satisfaction as he watched her do it. And in that moment, I understood something horrifying and confirmed everything Evan had told me outside. Ryan didn't even glance at my glass anymore. His eyes were locked on Emily. That confirmed it beyond any doubt. He knew exactly which glass was supposed to be dangerous, and he was watching to see the effects begin, except he was watching the wrong person, because his own wife had just swallowed whatever they intended for me. For the next several minutes, everything seemed almost unbearably normal. We finished our meal. We talked about small things, old memories, a trip we once took to the coast when Emily was young. I forced myself to laugh at the right moments, to nod at the right times, all while my entire body stayed tense, watching Emily from the corner of my eye, waiting. Then I saw it. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. She blinked several times, as if trying to clear her vision, and when she spoke next, her words came out slightly slower than before, slightly slurred at the edges, the exact kind of behavior I imagined they had planned for me to display in front of witnesses. Ryan noticed it too, and I watched confusion spread across his face, quickly followed by something closer to panic. He asked Emily if she was feeling all right, and she said she felt strange, dizzy, like the room was tilting slowly to one side. I asked if she needed anything, keeping my voice calm, concerned, exactly the way a worried father should sound, and she shook her head, insisting she was fine, probably just tired from the excitement of the week. But she wasn't fine. Within another few minutes, her hands were shaking more visibly, and she pressed her palm against her forehead, saying the lights in the room seemed too bright, that everything felt fuzzy around the edges. Ryan stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled backward, and for the first time all evening, I saw real fear on his face, not the practiced concern of a man performing for an audience, but genuine fear, because whatever plan he and Emily had built together was now happening to the wrong person, and there was nothing he could do to stop it without revealing exactly what they had done. He called for a waiter, asking for water, asking if there was a doctor nearby, his voice rising with each word, and I sat there watching my own daughter grow paler by the second, her eyes struggling to focus, her breathing becoming shallow and uneven, and despite everything I now knew about what she had tried to do to me, some small broken part of my heart still ached watching her suffer, because underneath the anger and the betrayal, she was still my little girl, and no father can watch his child fall apart in front of him without feeling something crack open inside his chest. I stood up and told Ryan we needed to call an ambulance immediately, and for one brief second, I saw hesitation flash across his face, actual hesitation, as if some part of him was calculating whether calling for help would expose the very secret he was trying to protect. But the panic on his face was real enough that he pulled out his phone and dialed anyway. Because whatever cold calculations he was running behind his eyes, he clearly hadn't planned for his own wife to end up in this condition. Emily's eyes rolled slightly, her body slumping sideways in her chair, and I caught her before she could fall, holding her upright, feeling how weak and unsteady she had become in a matter of minutes. And I remember thinking, even in that moment of chaos, that whatever substance they had put in that wine was strong enough to do exactly what it was designed to do: make a person appear completely, convincingly, medically unstable. The restaurant staff rushed in within minutes, someone shouting for a first aid kit, someone else clearing a path toward the door for the paramedics who were already on their way. And through all of it, I kept holding my daughter steady, my mind splitting into two completely different places at once. One part of me terrified for her safety despite everything, and another part of me, colder and sharper than I had ever felt before, already calculating what came next, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning of a much longer fight, and the ambulance ride to the hospital that night would mark the moment everything between my daughter, her husband, and me changed forever, in ways none of us could take back. Section 5. The Turning Point. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee, and I sat there for nearly 3 hours that night, watching doctors and nurses move in and out of the room where my daughter lay hooked up to machines I didn't fully understand. And somewhere in those 3 hours, something inside me finished changing completely, from a frightened father into a man with a plan. Ryan paced the hallway the entire time, making phone calls in hushed, urgent tones, always turning away whenever I walked near, always ending calls a little too quickly the moment he noticed me watching him, and I let him believe I was too exhausted, too worried, too broken to pay attention to anything he was doing, because the less he suspected I understood, the more room I had to move. Around midnight, a doctor finally came out to speak with us, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, and she explained that Emily had ingested a substance that mimicked the early symptoms of severe cognitive decline, something designed very deliberately to create confusion, slurred speech, memory lapses, and disorientation, the exact symptoms a judge might associate with dementia if presented as evidence in a courtroom. She said it wasn't lethal, thankfully, and that Emily would likely make a full recovery within a day or two once the substance cleared her system. But she also said something that confirmed everything Evan had told me, something about the specific formulation being unusual, precise, clearly designed for this exact purpose rather than any accidental poisoning. Ryan's face went pale as the doctor spoke, and when she asked if either of us had any idea how this could have happened, he stammered through an explanation about a new medication Emily had recently started, some story about a mix-up with dosages, and I watched him build his lie in real time, watched him try to steer the doctor away from asking too many questions, and I understood in that moment that Ryan was not simply protecting himself. He was protecting a plan that was far bigger and far more organized than one bad decision made over dinner. That night, once Emily was stable and sleeping, and Ryan had finally left to get coffee from the machine down the hall, I sat alone beside my daughter's hospital bed and made a decision that would define everything that came after. I was not going to confront them with anger. I was not going to scream or cry or demand answers the way another man might have. I had spent 40 years building a company by staying calm when everyone around me panicked, by thinking 3 steps ahead, while my competitors reacted to whatever was directly in front of them. And I was going to use that same discipline now. Except this time the stakes were not a business deal. They were my freedom, my mind, and everything I had worked my entire life to build. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I called Harrison Wright. Harrison had been my lawyer for over 20 years, a sharp, quiet man who had guided me through mergers, lawsuits, and negotiations that would have destroyed lesser businessmen. And he was the only person in my life I trusted completely with something this dangerous. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep, and I told him everything, every detail, the wine, the switch, the note from Evan, the word guardianship, the doctor named Reed that Ryan had mentioned on the phone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Harrison said something I will never forget. He said, "Peter, if what you're telling me is true, they've likely already filed preliminary paperwork with a judge. We need to move faster than they expect." That single sentence lit a fire in me that burned away the last of my grief and confusion, replacing it with absolute focus. Harrison explained that cases like this, involving claims of diminished mental capacity, often move through emergency hearings designed to protect vulnerable individuals quickly, which meant Ryan and Emily could potentially have a judge granting temporary guardianship within days if they had already built a convincing enough case, complete with medical documentation from a cooperating doctor. We needed evidence, real evidence, proof that this was a coordinated conspiracy rather than a tragic misunderstanding, and we needed it fast. Over the next 2 days, while Emily recovered in her hospital bed and Ryan hovered nearby, playing the role of devoted, worried husband, I quietly built my counterattack. Harrison hired a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud, a sharp woman named Denise who within 24 hours uncovered a trail of communications between Ryan and a man named Dr. Marcus Reed, a physician whose medical license had been quietly investigated twice before for questionable psychiatric evaluations submitted in court cases involving elderly patients and inheritance disputes. Denise found emails, careful and coded but ultimately damning, discussing an evaluation scheduled for me the following week, an evaluation Ryan had already paid for in advance, along with a separate payment described only as a consulting fee that Denise believed was actually a bribe disguised as legitimate business. I sat in Harrison's office reading printouts of those emails with my hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from a rage so controlled and so cold that I almost didn't recognize the sound of my own voice when I finally spoke. Harrison looked at me across his desk and asked if I was ready for what came next, because once we moved forward, there would be no quiet resolution, no private family conversation where everyone apologized and moved on. This would become a legal battle, public, painful, and permanent, the kind that would fracture whatever relationship remained between Emily and me forever. I thought about that little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. I thought about the years I missed, the years I told myself I would make up for one day when the company finally succeeded. And then I thought about her hand hovering near my wine glass, about the calm, practiced way she had slipped something into my drink at a dinner meant to celebrate everything I had built. I told Harrison I was ready. He nodded once, pulled a folder from his desk drawer, and began explaining exactly how we were going to expose Ryan's entire conspiracy in the one place he never expected to lose control, a courtroom, in front of a judge, with evidence so overwhelming that no amount of charm or fake concern could talk his way out of it. Over the following days, while Ryan continued planning his emergency guardianship hearing, confident that his fabricated story and his corrupt doctor would be enough to convince a judge I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, he had no idea that I was no longer the confused, vulnerable old man he believed he was dealing with. He had no idea that Harrison and Denise were building a case strong enough to destroy not just his plan, but his entire reputation. He had no idea that Dr. Reed's financial records were already sitting in a folder on Harrison's desk, ready to be presented at exactly the right moment. And most importantly, he had no idea that I would be the one walking into that courtroom, not confused, not disoriented, not a victim, but sharp, composed, and absolutely ready to fight for everything I had spent my entire life building. The next morning, Ryan received a court notice confirming the emergency guardianship hearing had been scheduled. He smiled when he read it, certain that victory was finally within reach. He had no idea that smile would be the last confident moment he would ever have in my presence. Section 6. Final Confrontation. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled walls, tired fluorescent lighting, the kind of room where ordinary tragedies played out every single day. Except this tragedy belonged to my family, and I walked through those doors that morning wearing my best suit, standing perfectly straight, my mind sharper and clearer than it had been in years. Ryan sat at the opposing table beside a lawyer I didn't recognize, someone young and confident, clearly hired to present a simple, sympathetic story to the judge, and beside him sat Dr. Reed, a thin man in expensive glasses who kept glancing nervously toward the door every few minutes, as if some part of him already sensed something was wrong. Emily wasn't there. Ryan had told the court she was too emotionally distressed to attend, still recovering from what he described as a frightening medical episode connected to her father's declining condition. And I remember feeling something twist painfully in my chest, hearing my own daughter's absence used as a weapon against me, spun into evidence of just how much distress my supposed instability had caused the family. When I walked in and took my seat beside Harrison, I watched Ryan's confident expression flicker for just a moment, a small crack in his composure, because the man walking into that courtroom was not the confused, fragile figure he had built his entire case around. I looked healthy. I looked alert. I looked exactly like a 68-year-old man who had just successfully sold a company for $60 million, because that is precisely who I was. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Alvarez, opened the hearing by asking Ryan's lawyer to present their case for emergency guardianship, and I sat quietly, my hands folded calmly on the table, while the young lawyer stood and described a heartbreaking story of a beloved father slowly losing his grip on reality, becoming erratic, confused, and potentially dangerous to himself, citing a recent hospital incident as clear evidence of his declining mental state. It was almost impressive, listening to him twist the truth so completely, turning the night Emily nearly poisoned me into proof that I was the one falling apart. Dr. Reed was called to the stand next, and he spoke with practiced confidence about a preliminary evaluation he claimed to have conducted, describing symptoms of confusion and memory loss that simply did not exist, reading from notes that Harrison would later prove were fabricated entirely, written before he had ever actually examined me. When it was finally our turn, Harrison stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the center of the room with the calm confidence of a man who had already won 100 battles just like this one. He began by asking Judge Alvarez for permission to submit a series of documents into evidence, financial records, private investigator reports, and email communications recovered through legal channels. And as he spoke, I watched Ryan's lawyer lean over and whisper something urgent into his client's ear. Harrison walked the judge through everything, slowly, methodically, laying out each piece of evidence like a man building a wall brick by brick, until there was no possible way to see around it. He showed the court records of Dr. Reed's medical license, including 2 prior investigations for submitting fraudulent psychiatric evaluations in inheritance disputes almost identical to this one. He showed bank records revealing a payment of $15,000 from Ryan directly to Dr. Reed, disguised as a consulting fee, but sent just 2 days before the scheduled evaluation, an evaluation meant to declare me mentally incompetent before I had ever even met the man claiming to have assessed me. Then Harrison played something that made the entire courtroom go completely silent. An audio recording, recovered from Evan's phone, the young waiter who had risked everything to warn me that night. A recording he had secretly captured while clearing a nearby table, catching Ryan's voice clearly saying the words, "Once Reed signs off on the evaluation, we file for guardianship by Friday, and the accounts transfer within 30 days. Ryan's face drained of all color as those words echoed through the courtroom. His lawyer sat frozen, clearly hearing this recording for the first time, and I watched Dr. Reed shift uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence completely gone. Judge Alvarez looked directly at Ryan, her expression hardening, and asked him to explain the recording. He tried, stammering through some explanation about the conversation being taken out of context, but the damage was already done, and everyone in that room, including the judge, knew exactly what they were listening to. Harrison wasn't finished. He submitted one final piece of evidence, phone records showing Emily and Ryan had scheduled this exact court date nearly 2 weeks before that celebration dinner ever took place, proving beyond any doubt that this entire evening, the dinner, the toast, the wine, had been carefully planned in advance, not some spontaneous reconciliation between a father and daughter, but a calculated trap set months in the making. I stood up then, and Harrison nodded for me to speak, giving me the floor for the first time in that hearing. I looked directly at Ryan as I spoke, my voice steady and calm despite everything churning underneath the surface. I told the court that I had spent 40 years building a company from nothing, surviving failures that would have broken most men, learning to read people who wanted to destroy me before they even realized I could see through them. I told the judge that my daughter had tried to poison me at a dinner meant to celebrate the greatest achievement of my life, and that her husband had orchestrated a plan so calculated, so cold, that he was willing to let his own wife suffer the consequences meant for me rather than risk exposing his scheme. I told her I wasn't standing there seeking revenge. I was standing there seeking the truth, because the man they described in this courtroom, confused, unstable, incapable of managing his own life, simply did not exist. Judge Alvarez sat quietly for a long moment after I finished speaking, reviewing the evidence spread across her desk, and then she spoke words I will remember for the rest of my life. She dismissed the guardianship petition entirely, citing overwhelming evidence of fraud and conspiracy. She ordered an immediate investigation into Dr. Reed's medical license, likely resulting in permanent revocation. And she stated, directly and clearly, that Peter Shaw appeared before this court fully competent, sharp, and completely capable of managing his own affairs, adding that the true instability in this case belonged not to me, but to the people who had conspired against me. Ryan sat frozen at his table, his carefully constructed plan lying in ruins around him, and as security approached to discuss potential criminal charges related to fraud and conspiracy, I felt something inside me finally settle, not joy exactly. Nothing about this felt like victory in any way that brought happiness, but something closer to peace. The quiet certainty that no matter how badly someone tries to convince the world you are weak, the truth eventually finds its way into the light. Emily visited me 3 weeks later, alone, without Ryan, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where I used to hold her as a baby. And for a long time neither of us said anything at all, just two people staring at cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. She told me she was sorry, that Ryan had convinced her I was already slipping, already becoming someone she didn't recognize, and that stealing control of my fortune felt, to her twisted way of thinking at the time, like protecting it rather than stealing it. I wanted to believe her. Some small, foolish part of me still does. But trust, once broken this deeply, doesn't simply rebuild itself because someone finally says sorry across a kitchen table. I told her that healing would take time, real time, not weeks or months, but possibly years, and that she would need to earn back something she had thrown away so easily that night at the restaurant. She nodded, tears falling quietly down her face, and for the first time in 5 years, I saw something real behind her eyes instead of a performance. Ryan is currently facing multiple charges, including fraud and conspiracy, and Dr. Reed's medical license was permanently revoked following the investigation Judge Alvarez ordered. Emily was never charged, since the evidence showed she was as much a victim of Ryan's manipulation as she was a participant in his scheme, though I know that distinction will take her a long time to understand about herself. As for me, I still run parts of my business today, not because I need the money, but because building things gives my life meaning, the same way it always has. I found Evan a few weeks after everything settled and offered him a position managing operations for one of my smaller companies. A young man with that kind of courage deserves more than minimum wage and a restaurant apron. He accepted, and honestly, watching him grow into that role has brought me more joy than almost anything else that came out of this entire ordeal. People ask me sometimes if I regret selling the company, if I regret inviting Emily and Ryan to celebrate that night, if I wish I could go back and change any part of what happened. I tell them no, every time, because that night taught me something I never fully understood in 40 years of building an empire. Experience isn't just knowledge you gain from success. It's the quiet wisdom you carry from surviving betrayal, from learning to trust your instincts even when the people you love most are the ones giving you reason to doubt them. Greed convinced 2 people that an old man's mind was worth stealing. But patience, and 40 years of learning how to read a room before anyone else in it, proved far stronger than any plan they could build against me. I am 68 years old, and I have never felt more certain of exactly who I am. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing my story, it's this. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has already survived everything life has thrown at them, because the people who assume you are weak are usually the ones who end up learning, far too late, exactly how wrong they were.